The city had learned to clean itself. That was how the news anchors framed it during the first weeks of the purge as sanitation. Public health enforcement. The eradication of a biological threat that had existed undetected beneath the surface of modern life for centuries. Cameras showed government task forces in hazmat gear moving through condemned apartment blocks. Officials in pressed suits described containment protocols and risk mitigation. The language was careful, institutional, scrubbed of anything that might remind a viewer of what was actually being hunted. But Blade had been doing this long enough to read what the language was hiding. He stood on the fire escape of a decommissioned textile plant, 3 blocks east of a police checkpoint, watching the street below through the gap between 2 rusted railings. The checkpoint had been there for 6 nights. 4 officers at the barrier, 2 more in a cruiser parked sideways across the mouth of the intersection. Standard configuration for a soft perimeter, the kind designed to slow foot traffic rather than stop it, to funnel movement rather than restrict it. The officers rotated on 2-hour cycles. Somewhere beyond the barrier, a refrigerated truck had idled for 40 minutes before a wave of a flashlight sent it through. Blade watched the truck's taillights shrink and vanish. A refrigerated truck cleared through a police checkpoint at 2 in the morning, heading deeper into a zone designated restricted under the purge statutes. Not unusual on its face. Cold storage for biological materials was a standard element of the new enforcement architecture. Evidence transport specimen, handling the bureaucratic machinery of a war being fought under laboratory conditions. He had seen 6 similar vehicles in the past 4 nights. Different plates each time, same weight distribution, same handling on the turns. He dropped off the fire escape onto the alley below, landed without sound, and moved. The city at this hour had a particular texture, and not quiet exactly, but compressed, as if everything happening was happening at reduced volume. Sirens in the middle distance, the low hum of generators behind the police barriers. Somewhere north, the rhythmic thud of a helicopter running a search pattern. Blade moved through it like an error in the data. He used the service alleys behind the restaurant row, the drainage channel running parallel to the main avenue, the gap between a parking structure and the loading dock of a defunct grocery warehouse. 2 weeks building this map of negative space, the route's cameras didn't cover the intervals between patrol sweeps, the blind spots the Purge's new surveillance grid had not yet filled. He emerged on the far side of the checkpoint zone 2 minutes later and picked up the truck's trail by scent. Refrigerant diesel exhaust, and beneath both of those, something that had no business being in a cargo hold, the faint iron edge of stored blood. Not fresh, processed. The kind that came out of industrial centrifuges rather than veins. Blade had learned the difference a long time ago. Fresh blood announced itself. Processed blood was quieter, almost pharmaceutical, and the only reason to move it in bulk through a police-managed corridor at 2 in the morning was if it was going somewhere the daylight hours couldn't accommodate. He followed the scent north. The industrial district opened up around him, warehouse facades, corrugated steel loading bays fitted with heavy security shutters. Most of the buildings were dark. A few had the particular quality of darkness that came from occupancy rather than vacancy. The subtle glow of indicator lights behind blacked-out windows, the ghost of heat from HVAC systems running on internal power. Blade noted them in passing and kept moving. The truck had stopped. He found it backed into a loading bay on the ground floor of a 7-story structure with no signage on the exterior. The bay doors were already open. 2 men in cargo pants and insulated jackets transferred sealed crates from the truck's interior onto a motorized pallet jack. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this dozens of times. No conversation, no wasted motion. The crates were roughly coffin-sized, sealed with industrial latching hardware, and stenciled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing without the key. Blade positioned himself on the roof of the loading dock's canopy and watched. The pallet jack carried the crates inside. The bay doors came down. The two men returned to the truck cab, and 3 minutes later, the vehicle rolled back toward the checkpoint zone. The entire operation had taken 11 minutes. Clean practiced invisible to anyone not already looking. He gave it 30 seconds, then went in through the ventilation shaft on the building's east face. The interior was larger than the exterior suggested. The ground floor gutted and rebuilt the original warehouse, bones reinforced with steel framing and poured concrete that hadn't been there when the building was permitted. Cold air moved through the space in managed currents. The lighting ran blue, white, and low, the kind used in environments where temperature control mattered more than human comfort. The crates from the loading bay sat staged near the freight elevator, each tagged with a secondary label affixed after the original stenciling. The label bore a corporate logo, a stylized double helix inside a circle, and a name in clean sans serif type. Antigen. Blade read it twice. He had pulled threads before work to target back through layers of shell companies and intermediaries, until he found the thing actually generating the threat. This was faster than most. 6 nights of surveillance, 4 nights of tracking cargo, and here was a name. Not a coven, not a nest operating out of a condemned building and calling it territory. A company. Incorporated, permitted running refrigerated trucks through government checkpoints with official clearance. He photographed the label with a small device clipped inside his coat, then moved to the freight elevator shaft. It dropped 3 levels below ground. He took the stairs. The basement levels ran warmer than the floor above, more sterile, the air carrying the sharp bite of industrial disinfectant over something older and harder to name. Corridors narrow and finished in institutional tile. Blade moved without sound, building the layout as he went. Server room, cold storage anteroom, a reinforced door at the far end of the second sublevel that pulsed with temperature differential strong enough to feel through the gap at the threshold, cryogenic systems behind it. Multiple units drawing significant power from the conduit running overhead. He did not open the door. Not yet. The operations room sat at the corridor's end, monitoring equipment, rack-mounted servers, a workstation left logged in. On the screen, a transport manifest. Line items, listed as biological specimens, tagged with subject numbers rather than names. A status column on the right tracked each transfer received, processed, stored. The last entry had been logged 43 minutes ago. The next scheduled delivery was in 3 days. Blade scanned the manifest and held it. Then he looked at the routing header, originating facility distribution network, the authorization chain required to sign off on each transfer, corporate procurement, supply chain logistics. Architecture built for scale, not for a single operation running dark in one city. This was not a hunting ground. This was a factory. He was back on the street in under 4 minutes, moving south through the drainage channel, putting distance between himself and the building at a pace that left no trace on the wet pavement. The city pressed in from all sides, the helicopter still running its pattern to the north, the checkpoint generators humming their low note 2 blocks west. He covered 2 miles before he stopped in the shelter of a highway overpass and stood still long enough to sort what he had found. A corporate operation. Cold storage infrastructure scaled well beyond what individual specimen handling required. Refrigerated transport on regular routes through purge-managed corridors, which meant either legitimate government clearance or someone inside the clearance process. Subject numbers, a distribution network. The kind of logistical weight that didn't get built around small ambitions. He had come to this city following freight anomalies, a contact in Chicago, unusual patterns in cold storage transport that didn't match pharmaceutical distribution schedules. He had expected a coven using the purge's chaos as cover to expand. He had not expected to find a processing chain with a corporate face and a supply line. He filed the adjustment, find the machine, cut its head off. That was still the job. The man who sold blood ran his operation out of a refrigeration repair depot on the south edge of the freight district, sandwiched between a tire recapping plant and a decommissioned rail spur. His name was Gregor. He was not a vampire. He was something more common and in some ways more dangerous, a human being who had decided that the existence of supernatural predators represented a business opportunity rather than a threat. Blade had found him through the manifest. The routing header from Antigen's operations room had listed 3 supply intermediaries in the regional distribution chain. 2 were shell entities with addresses that resolved to empty lots. The third, a cold chain logistics broker operating under the name Hollander Freight Solutions, had a physical office, a registered vehicle fleet, and a commercial account with a refrigeration depot. It had taken Blade one afternoon to work from Hollander back to Gregor, and another 6 hours of watching the depot's rear loading area to understand what Gregor actually moved. Not all of it was blood. Most of the traffic through the depot was legitimate compressor units, refrigerant canisters, replacement parts for walk-in coolers. But 3 times in those 6 hours, a different kind of transaction took place. A panel van would pull up to a side gate that was kept locked except during those exchanges. The driver would hand over a sealed thermal case no bigger than a carry-on bag. Gregor's man at the gate, a thick-necked individual named, according to the vehicle registration Blade had run 2 nights prior. Dennis Farrow would log the delivery on a handheld scanner, hand back a paper receipt, and wave the van off. The thermal cases went directly into a walk-in unit that Blade had clocked as running 10 degrees colder than the others. On the 4th visit, Blade was already inside the walk-in. He had gone in through a utility access panel on the depot's north wall behind the compressor housing at a point where the security camera's field of view terminated 6 feet short of the entry point. The gap was not accidental. Someone had repositioned the camera bracket recently, just enough to create the blind spot without making it obvious on casual inspection. Whoever had done it knew what they were doing. Blade filed that detail and used the gap anyway. The walk-in ran at -4 Celsius. Racked along 3 walls were thermal cases identical to the ones he had watched being delivered. Sealed, stickered with Antigen's double helix mark, and sorted by a secondary alphanumeric code that matched the format from the transport manifest. He counted 41 cases. At the intake rate he had observed that represented approximately 2 weeks of accumulated stock, which meant this depot was not a transit point. It was a buffer, a reserve node in the supply chain positioned to maintain continuity if one of the primary delivery routes went down. Blade photographed the rack configuration, the case labels, and the cold chain log sheet pinned to a clipboard near the door. The log listed delivery timestamps, origin codes, and a destination field that had been filled in with a consistent abbreviation ANT-PROC-02. A second processing facility, not the building from the previous night. He was out of the walk-in and back through the utility access before Farrow finished logging the 4th delivery. The second thread ran through a man who sold ammunition. His name was Renner, and he operated from a storage unit in a self-storage complex east of the rail yard, which he accessed every Tuesday and Thursday between 11 at night and 2 in the morning. Blade had located him not through the Antigen manifest, but through a separate channel, a pattern in the city's underground arms market that had been running parallel to the cold chain anomalies. Someone was buying silver composite rounds in bulk. Not the kind of bulk that suggested individual use. Blade reached the storage complex at 11:40 on a Thursday and found Renner's unit already occupied. He took a position on the roof of the adjacent unit block 8 feet above and 30 feet back and watched through a gap in the corrugated roofing. Renner was mid-transaction with a buyer. Blade did not recognize a lean individual in a field jacket who moved with the controlled economy of someone accustomed to operating in hostile spaces. The goods on the folding table between them were laid out in foam-lined cases, silver composite ammunition in 3 calibers, UV spectrum rounds in a format, Blade had not seen commercially available, and a set of modified magazine bodies designed to segregate load types. 2-weapon system, one for each side of a war. The buyer was not picking a side. The buyer was supplying both. Blade watched the transaction complete. The buyer packed the cases into a duffel and left. Renner began restocking the table from a steel locker at the rear of the unit. Blade dropped from the roof, crossed the 15 feet of open ground between units in under 2 seconds, and was inside before Renner got the locker shut. Renner turned around and found Blade standing 4 feet away in the half-light of a single work lamp and went very still. "Antigen," Blade said. Renner's jaw worked for a moment. "I don't..." Blade set the photograph of the Antigen label on the folding table between them without looking away from Renner's face. "How often?" The stillness in the room was the specific kind produced by a person calculating how much trouble they were actually in. Renner arrived at the answer faster than most. "Every 72 hours, he said. "Give or take. Depends on the run." Routes. 3. North through the freight district, east through the river corridor, south bypass via the tunnel access off Meridian. Renner's voice had settled into something flat and cooperative, the tone of a man who had made a pragmatic decision. "The south route goes through a utility junction, not on any public map. Antigen's people punched a side access into the tunnel system about 8 months ago." Blade looked at him for a moment. "The junction. You've been through it. Twice, delivering to a secondary drop inside the tunnel system. There's a keypad at the utility door, 6-digit rolling code resets every 48 hours. The code for the current cycle is written on the inside of the second case lid." He nodded toward the foam-lined cases still on the table. "The buyer just took that one. What's the rotation schedule for the internal security sweep at the tunnel junction?" Renner blinked. 40 minutes. Camera coverage is IR, but there's a dead zone in the southwest corner of the junction room where the IR emitter doesn't reach about a 3-foot gap near the pipe manifold. Blade picked up the photograph from the table and put it back inside his coat. He looked at Renner for another 3 seconds, long enough to make the weight of it felt, then turned and left. Outside the storage complex was quiet. A dog somewhere in the residential blocks to the west was barking at nothing. Blade crossed the lot and slipped back through the gap in the perimeter fence he had used, coming in, moving along the drainage easement that ran behind the complex until the lights of the main road appeared ahead. The third thread was the thinnest and the most useful. A woman named Carla Voss managed transit documentation for a freight brokerage that held a government clearance contract for biological material transport, one of 11 such contractors licensed under the Purge's new regulatory framework. She processed the paperwork that allowed Antigen's convoys to move through enforcement lines without inspection. Blade had identified her through the authorization chain in the manifest, traced her to an apartment block near the university district, and spent 40 minutes reading the pattern of her movements before concluding that she was not a willing participant in whatever Antigen was running. She signed the forms because the forms looked legitimate. The forms looked legitimate because someone at Antigen's end understood exactly how to make them look that way. He did not approach her. What she represented was something more valuable than an interview. She was evidence that Antigen had institutional cover. Someone with access to the regulatory framework had designed the paperwork trail, which meant the company was not simply operating beneath the Purge's enforcement apparatus. It was threaded through it. Blade stood at the end of her block for a while, watching her window third-floor light still on at 1 a.m. Then he turned north and walked. 72-hour delivery cycle. 3 routes, one of them running through an unmapped utility access. A buffer node holding 2 weeks of reserve stock. A rolling keypad code that reset every 48 hours. Institutional clearance built into the regulatory framework itself. He had what he needed for the next phase. The machine had veins. He had just finished mapping them. Now he needed the door. They reached out to him first. That was the part that told him the most. Not the message itself, a burner phone left in a takeout bag, wedged behind a dumpster 2 blocks from the storage complex, where Blade had walked away from Renner, the phone already ringing when he found it. But the logistics of how it got there. Someone had been watching him work. Someone who knew his route, anticipated his exit, and had the resources to position an intermediary without triggering any of the perimeter awareness Blade maintained as a reflex. That level of operational reach inside a city running purge enforcement meant money and people and patience. He let it ring 3 times before he answered. "You have 48 hours of access code," said the voice on the line. Mel measured the accent faint enough to be cultivated. "We have the physical key. There's a second entry point to the tunnel junction, a storm drain connection on the river corridor side that Antigen never mapped, because we put it there before they built over it." Blade said nothing. "We're not asking for an alliance," the voice continued. "We're asking for a service. You go in, you destroy what's inside you, walk out. We handle the documentation that makes Antigen's government clearance disappear afterward." "Where?" The address was a parking structure near the old waterfront, 6 stories, currently mothballed under a city infrastructure review. "Top level northeast corner, 2 hours." Blade ended the call and spent 90 minutes scouting the structure before he went in. Then, the top floor was open to the sky on 3 sides. Concrete barriers crumbling at the joints, weeds pushing through expansion cracks the whole level. Smelling of standing water and rust. 4 of them waited in the northeast corner, positioned with the studied casualness of people who had done negotiations in hostile territory before. 2 stood back near the stairwell exit, hands, visible weapons holstered but accessible. A 3rd sat on the hood of a stripped sedan, watching Blade with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to waiting out humans. The 4th stood apart from the group, a woman dark-coated, her posture carrying the kind of controlled readiness that came from centuries rather than training. She spoke first. "I expected you sooner." "I was busy," Blade said. Her name, he would learn, was Iona. She had the bearing of someone who had held rank before the purge stripped most of what rank meant: old authority wearing new clothes and knowing the difference. She studied him with eyes that had cataloged a great many threats across a great many years, and had not yet decided where he fit. "You've been dismantling Antigen's supply network for 3 nights, she said. "You're not doing it for us. You're not doing it for the humans either. I'm doing it because it needs doing." That's a convenient answer. It's the only one you're getting. She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, one of the 2 by the stairwell had shifted weight, a small adjustment barely perceptible. Blade had clocked it before the man's boot finished moving. "Antigen has something we want back," Iona said. "Specimens taken during the initial purge sweeps. 6 of our people held in cryogenic storage in the processing facility you've been mapping. We want them out." "Not my problem. We can give you the second entry point. The storm drain connection. It bypasses the keypad entirely and puts you inside the junction room through a maintenance hatch behind the pipe manifold right at the edge of the IR dead zone. No code required, no exposure window." Blade looked at her. "What do you want from me in exchange?" "Destroy the lab. The specimen processing equipment, the data archive, the sample reserve, all of it. When Antigen can't continue its work, the political pressure to maintain their government clearance collapses. Our people come out in the process. And you get to rebuild. We get to survive." He let the words sit for a moment, then said, "Your survival isn't part of the contract." Her expression didn't change. but something behind it recalibrated. We're not asking you to protect us. We're asking you to destroy something that's killing us both. I'm going to destroy it because it's building weapons, Blade said. Not because it's hurting you. He paused. The storm drain access. Coordinates and depth markers, now. Iona looked at him for 3 seconds, measuring, not negotiating, then nodded once to the man on the sedan. He produced a folded paper from his coat and held it out. Blade didn't move toward it. Set it on the ground. The man glanced at Iona. She gave a slight nod. He set the paper on the cracked concrete and stepped back. Blade crossed to it, crouched, opened it, without taking his eyes fully off the group. Coordinates a hand-drawn cross-section of the drain connection depth markers at 2 points, and a notation indicating the maintenance hatch dimensions and its orientation relative to the pipe manifold. He folded the paper and put it inside his coat. The 6 specimens, Iona said. Subject numbers. We need you to pull the cryo logs for their tank assignments when you're inside. I said I'd destroy the lab. I didn't say I'd run errands. They're our people. They're subject numbers on a storage log. Blade straightened. If they're still viable when the facility goes down, that's their problem and yours, not mine. The 2 by the stairwell had gone very still. Blade tracked them in his peripheral vision without looking at them directly. Weight distribution distance, the angle each would need to cover to close on him. Neither had the read of someone about to make a decision. They were waiting on Iona. She studied him another moment. Then, you're going to do what you're going to do, regardless of what we offer. That's right. Then why are you still here? Making sure you understand the terms. He looked at her steadily. I take the access point. I go in on my schedule, not yours. I destroy what needs destroying. After that, what's left of Antigen is your business, not mine. You don't follow me in. You don't use this as cover to move on anyone while I'm inside. He let the last sentence carry its full weight. If I find out you did the next conversation we have, won't be a negotiation. Iona held his gaze without flinching. Whatever calculation was running behind her expression, it took only a moment to complete. Agreed? Blade turned and walked toward the vehicle ramp. He did not look back at the stairwell. Sant, outside the waterfront access road, was empty in both directions. A fine rain had started while he was on the top floor, sheeting across the street lamps in thin diagonal lines. He walked north along the service road, the folded papers sitting against his ribs, the weight of it less significant than what it represented. He had what Renner hadn't been able to give him, the approach that didn't require timing. A rolling code didn't expose him to the IR sweep window and put him directly at the edge of the dead zone. The Coven had built the access point for their own use years before Antigen arrived, and now they were handing it over because they had no other play. That was how it usually worked with Covens. They traded what they couldn't protect for the chance that someone else's damage would fall on their enemies instead of them. It didn't make them allies. It made them useful. There was a difference, and Blade had never once confused the two. He had a door, he had a route. He had the operational window, the 40-minute sweep cycle Renner had given him, the IR dead zone, the maintenance hatch behind the manifold. Someone named Lane was running Antigen. The name had come up once in the cross-reference data from the authorization chain, a single signature at the top of the clearance paperwork. One name, one signature, one person who had built this entire apparatus and was still standing at the center of it. The machine had a head. Time to cut it off. She woke inside the dark. Not the dark of a room with the lights off. The dark of a sealed chamber, pressurized, temperature-controlled the air, carrying the chemical bite of cryoprotectant compounds and the low electrical hum of systems that had been running without interruption for a very long time. Celine knew the difference before her eyes opened. Her body was already registering the wrongness of it. The stiffness in her joints, that had nothing to do with injury, the disorientation in her inner ear that came from waking after extended suspension. She had been in cryo before. She had put people into cryo before. She had never woken from it alone in a place she didn't recognize with no one waiting. 3 seconds. She gave herself exactly 3 seconds to absorb it, the chamber, the hum, the dark, and then she moved. The cryo tank's interior release was a manual handle red, positioned at chest height on the inner wall. Someone had designed it that way deliberately, or someone had retrofitted it to comply with biomedical regulation, or someone had simply made a mistake. Celine didn't care which. She pulled it, felt the seal break, and pushed the panel open into a room flooded with blue-white light and the smell of industrial coolant. The chamber bay was large. 2 rows of cryo units ran the length of the room. Each one sealed, each one lived the status panels, showing green across the board. She was the only one awake. She stood in the gap between the rows, for a breath cataloging the room. Had 2 exits, one behind her, that connected back to what looked like a prep passage. One ahead through a set of reinforced double doors with a magnetic lock panel. The lock panel was running on backup power. A flicker in the indicator light suggested the primary system was under some kind of strain. Cameras in 3 corners, one blind spot northeast corner where a unit had been repositioned and left a gap in coverage. She went to the northeast corner and listened at the double doors before she touched them. 2 people moving on the other side, the sound of boots on concrete unhurried. A regular patrol, not a response. She timed the rhythm for 30 counts, then used the gap between footfalls to move. The hallway outside the bay was narrower than the room behind it. Steel walls, cable conduit, overhead lighting, strips running at floor level that gave everything a faint blue tinge. Celine moved along the left wall, keeping her profile low, piecing together the installation's layout from what she could see and what she could infer. The scale was wrong for a coven operation. Too large, too systematized, the signage, 2 institutional numbered rooms, hazard classifications, biometric readers on every 3rd door. This wasn't a safe house. It wasn't a converted building being used for purposes its architects hadn't intended. It had been built for this. She found the first dead checkpoint 40 meters along the passage, a security station with a glass-fronted booth, a monitor array, and a guard who was seated with his head at an angle that meant he was not going to be getting up again. No visible injury. No blood. The body had the precise stillness of someone rendered unconscious through means that left no external mark. She paused for a beat and looked at the monitor array. One camera feed was showing static. The timestamp on an adjacent feed had a 4-minute gap. Someone had been through here recently enough that the gap bead hadn't closed yet. She didn't know who. She filed it and kept moving. The stairwell was at the hallway's end, and that was where she heard it. 1 floor below, a sound that didn't belong to the building's mechanical baseline, a small quick breath, then silence, then the soft scrape of a shoe on concrete. Someone hiding. Someone small pressed into the angle beneath the stairwell landing, visible only from below. And only if you were looking. Celine descended the stairs without sound and came around the landing with her hand already raised, palm forward. The girl pressed against the wall had dark hair and eyes that were doing the work of measuring threat vectors rather than asking for help. She looked to be perhaps 16 slight, dressed in what appeared to be a standard-issue patient gown that had been partially supplemented with a jacket that was too large for her. She was frightened. She was also not moving in the way frightened people usually moved. There was something coiled in her stillness, something waiting underneath the fear. Celine recognized it. It was the same thing she had learned to hold at the center of herself during every engagement she had survived. "How long have you been in here?" Celine said low. The girl's jaw tightened. "Long enough to know the patrol rotation." Smart. Celine stepped down the last 2 stairs and crouched to bring herself level. There's a way out through the service level. Do you know it? I know 3 ways out. They're all watched. Not all of them. Celine held the girl's gaze. I'm going to get you out. Stay close. Don't make noise unless I tell you. The girl studied her for a moment, not the way a child studies an adult, but the way one combatant assesses another. Then she nodded once and pushed off the wall. Her name was Eve. Celine didn't learn it until they were moving the girl, keeping pace exactly 2 steps behind her, matching her rhythm without instruction. She offered the name the way someone offers identification to establish terms rather than to connect. Celine gave her own and didn't elaborate, and Eve asked nothing further.
What so?
They made it 3 levels before Quint found them. He came through a fire door at the end of a service run. No warning, no announcement. The door simply opening, and then a shape filling the frame that was too large and moved with the wrong kind of speed for the space it occupied. Celine had the gun up before the door finished its arc. 2 shots center mass and watched the impact register and then mean nothing. He crossed the gap in under 2 seconds. The hit that connected with Celine's shoulder wasn't a punch. It was closer to the leading edge of something structural, the kind of force that didn't bother with the mechanics of a strike because the mass behind it made mechanics irrelevant. She went into the wall and felt the plaster crack at her back, and the gun came out of her hand and skidded 6 feet down the run, and for 2 full seconds the signals her nervous system was sending had nothing useful in them. Eve was already moving, not away toward. She drove both hands into Quint's side with the kind of force that had no business coming from a frame her size, and the impact knocked him 1 step sideways. His head turned toward her. Something in the way he recalibrated the way his attention shifted from Celine to Eve. With the precision of a system reprioritizing a target was worse than the violence. It was clinical. She wasn't a threat to be neutralized. She was a resource to be recovered. Celine got to her feet. The 3 counts it took her to cross the stretch and pull Eve backward through a utility door to her left were the longest 3 counts she'd had in 12 years. Quint came after them and reached the door before it latched. She felt the handle resist against her grip, felt the gap widen by 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters. Then caught a sight line through the gap to a camera housing on the ceiling above the stretch, calculated the angle, and drove the door into its frame with her shoulder behind it at the exact moment Quint repositioned his weight. The latch caught. It wouldn't hold for long. It didn't need to. She grabbed Eve's wrist and ran.
Torg.
The service level below was a network of maintenance passages and mechanical rooms that the complex's primary security grid didn't fully cover. She knew this because the lighting was different down here. Older, and the camera housings she passed were a different model than the ones above, installed at a different time by a different contractor. Gaps in the system. Every large installation had them. She found the utility egress point 2 turns in a steel door with a push bar that led to an external access shaft, and beyond that a concrete stairwell that emerged at ground level behind the building's HVAC units. Cold air hit her face when she cracked the door, and the sound of the city came with it. Eve stepped through first. Celine followed, let the door close behind her, and stood in the narrow gap between the HVAC housing and the perimeter fence for a count, listening. No pursuit, not yet. She looked at the girl beside her, this hybrid child who had knocked a super lichen sideways and then stood her ground. For the half second it took Celine to recover, who had offered her name like a term of engagement, and had not once in the entire run from the stairwell to this fence line made a sound that wasn't tactically necessary. 12 years. She had been in suspension for 12 years, and the world she'd woken into had swallowed everything she'd known. Michael was still inside. She'd seen the tank designation on a display in the upper level, Subject 0, sealed status unknown, and had kept running because stopping was not an option, and Eve was alive and present, and Michael was neither of those things at this moment. This wasn't a war between species playing out on terms both sides understood. They weren't hunting out of territory disputes or power struggles, or the old grievances that had been running since before she was turned. They were harvesting. She pulled Eve away from the fence line and into the dark and did not look back. He found them in the drainage easement west of the Antigen perimeter, the woman and the girl pressed into the shadow of a concrete retaining wall. The woman's hand already moving toward the weapon at her hip before Blade had cleared the bend in the access channel. He stopped. She stopped. The girl between them did neither. She shifted her weight onto her back foot and turned slightly sideways, which was not what a frightened teenager did, and told him most of what he needed to know about her biology. Nobody fired. Nobody spoke for 3 seconds. Then Blade said, "You came out through the HVAC egress." The woman's eyes didn't move off him. Dark hair pale, the coat doing nothing to conceal what she was or what she carried. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to being the most dangerous thing in any given space, currently reassessing that assumption. "You were inside before me." "I was." "The guard at Junction 4. Alive. He'll have a headache." Blade looked at her steadily. "You're Celine." A pause. Not surprise calculation. "You've been in the system long enough." He didn't move toward her, didn't move away. The channel was narrow here, 8 feet across the walls, running with condensation, and the geometry of it meant that anyone who wanted to leave had to go through the other person first. He had chosen the meeting point for exactly that reason. "You know what Antigen is running?" "I know what they had in storage." Her voice was flat, the kind of flat that came from compressing a great deal of information into a very small space. "I know they have Michael." "Subject 0, still sealed when I went through the cryo level." He watched her absorb that. "They haven't processed him yet. That changes in approximately 60 hours when the next transport cycle completes and the facility shifts to full operational mode." The calculation in her expression sharpened into something closer to decision. "You're going back in." "I'm going in once. Tonight if the sweep window holds. Through the storm drain connection on the riverside." He paused. "I have coordinates. I have the approach. I have a 40-minute window between IR sweeps and a dead zone near the pipe manifold where the camera coverage doesn't reach." Another pause, deliberate. "What I don't have is current internal layout below sub-level 2 or the patrol pattern inside the cryo bay, since your exit triggered a partial lockdown." Celine looked at him for a long count. "Then what do you want from me?" "Layout. Patrol shifts. The path from the storm drain hatch to the data archive without crossing the primary security grid. And in exchange, I tell you where Michael's tank is positioned and give you a 12-minute window before I bring the archive down. Enough time to get to the cryo level and back out through the HVAC shaft before the system goes." She was quiet. The girl Eve had not moved from her sideways stance and was watching Blade with the kind of attention that was doing active work rather than simply registering. He did not look at her directly. She wasn't his concern, and she knew it, which meant she was smart enough to understand the shape of what was happening here. "Michael comes out," Celine said. "That's between you and whatever condition he's in, not my variable. The girl stays outside the perimeter." "Agreed." "She's not part of the operation." Something shifted in Celine's posture, not softening, but a recalibration the way a weapon settles into a new grip. "There's a secondary junction below sub-level 3 that doesn't appear on the facility schematics Antigen filed with the city. The cryo level connects to it through a maintenance shaft behind the primary coolant housing. Patrol rotation in the cryo bay runs on a 22-minute cycle since the lockdown, 4 guards, 2 at the door. 2 walking. The data archive sits 1 level above Cryo Northeast Quadrant, behind a biometric reader that cycles to manual override during power fluctuations. Blade listened without interrupting. She gave him the information the way someone empties a chamber complete. No hesitation, no embellishment. The primary security grid's blind stretch runs along the east wall of sub-level 2, she continued. 6 meters, enough to move between the maintenance shaft and the archive room without crossing a sensor threshold. She stopped. That's what I have. Good enough. He held her gaze. My plan, my timeline. You don't come in until I've cleared the archive level. If you go in early and compromise the sweep window, I pull out and the facility stays standing. Her jaw tightened slightly, and Michael stays sealed. And Michael stays sealed? Blade confirmed. No apology in it, just the shape of the condition. She held his look for another beat, that same measuring quality he had seen in the parking structure with Iona. Except this version had more edge to it, the kind that came from stakes that were personal rather than political. Then she gave a single nod. One more thing, Blade said. What? The Coven, Iona's group. They gave me the storm drain access in exchange for bringing the lab down. They know the timeline. He watched her face. If they move on the facility while I'm inside, I'll assume it was coordinated. Celine's expression didn't change, but her voice dropped a register. I don't work with covens. I know. I'm telling you so you know I know. He shifted his weight, preparing to move. 12 minutes from the time I reach the archive. After that, you're on your own timetable. He turned toward the drainage channel's eastern run, the direction of the storm drain approach. Daywalker. He stopped, but didn't turn. If Michael is viable, Celine said, I'm not leaving without him. I didn't ask you to. He walked Chanhur. The channel ran another 400 meters before it joined the river corridor's utility infrastructure, and Blade covered the distance with the kind of focus that left no room for noise. The plan was sound. The variables were manageable. Celine's layout data filled the one gap that had concerned him. The sub-level 3 junction, the 22-minute patrol cycle, the 6-meter blind stretch on the east wall. With those pieces in place, the approach from the storm drain hatch to the archive room had a viable route that didn't depend on timing a sweep or burning the access code Renner had mentioned. He had also taken her measure. She was exactly what the information had suggested. A death dealer running on a mission that had nothing to do with him, which meant her presence inside the facility would pull security attention toward the cryo level and away from the archive. 2 objectives in the same building moving on separate vectors, each one creating interference for the other's opposition. Not coordination, overlapping pressure. It was cleaner than working alone. He didn't tell her that. The storm drain access point was exactly where the Coven's coordinates had placed it. A steel grate set into the river corridor's retaining wall at waterline, secured with a padlock that someone had replaced with a combination lock, and then deliberately left on the wrong combination. He reset it, pulled the grate, and dropped into the dark below. 60 hours until the transport cycle completed. 1 archive, 1 cryo level. 1 man in a sealed tank who was either viable or wasn't, and either way wasn't Blade's problem. The machine had 40 minutes of vulnerability left in its sweep cycle. That was enough. The storm drain ran 8 feet wide and smelled of iron and standing water, the concrete walls carrying a low resonance from the city infrastructure above. Blade moved through it at a pace that was faster than a walk and quieter than anything it had any right to be the folded paper from the Coven's coordinator confirmed and committed to memory 3 days ago. 62 meters in the side channel branched right, and 20 meters further, the wall gave way to a maintenance panel set flush with the concrete, no handle on the outside, just a recessed catch that required pressure at a specific angle. He had the catch open in 4 seconds and was through before the IR sweep's 40-minute cycle had consumed another fraction of its interval. The pipe manifold room was dark and warm and smelled of hydraulic fluid. 3 meters to his left, the IR emitter's field terminated at the edge of the housing, the dead zone exactly where Celine had described it, a wedge of unmonitored space wide enough to stand in without triggering the sensor array. Blade stood in it for a full 10 seconds, listening to the building's baseline, the hum of server infrastructure 2 floors up, the mechanical cycling of the cryo system below, the distant rhythm of foot traffic on a different circuit entirely. Nothing reacted. The soft alert threshold hadn't been crossed. He moved. The vertical climb behind the primary coolant housing was exactly where Celine had placed it. A run of steel rungs rising 2 floors to the junction between the cryo tier and the archive floor above it. Blade took it in under 40 seconds, emerged in a utility alcove off the east wall of what the facility's own schematics would have called Level B2, and paused long enough to confirm the 6-meter blind stretch running along the wall to his right. The archive room's biometric reader was dark. Power fluctuations, something had pulled load off the primary grid in the last 2 minutes, enough to drop the reader to manual release. He didn't know what had caused the fluctuation. He didn't need to. He used the release panel, pushed the door, and was inside. The archive was 3 server banks and 1 workstation running live, the screens casting a blue-white wash across the floor. Blade went to the first bank and found the subject registry server in the 3rd slot labeled indexed, organized with the thoroughness of an operation that expected to scale. He pulled the drive housing and pocketed it, not to keep, to ensure the data didn't survive what came next. The second unit held the processing logs, chain of custody records, transport authorizations, the regulatory paperwork trail that gave Antigen's convoys their clearance. He pulled 2 drives and dropped them on the floor, then took a compact device from his coat and placed it against the stack's primary bus housing. Timed charge. 6 minutes from activation. He activated it and moved to the 3rd bank. The cold chain hub was here, the central coordination server for the buffer nodes, the routing data, the 72-hour delivery cycle that kept Antigen's supply network running without any single point of failure. Blade looked at it for 3 seconds, then drove the titanium blade of his sword through the housing at the junction between the primary processor and the redundant backup. The housing cracked. The indicator lights went from green to amber to nothing. Without the hub, the buffer nodes would begin receiving conflicting routing instructions within the next cycle. Gregor's Depot, the tunnel junction drop, all of them operating on stale data, no central arbitration, no way to verify authenticity. The supply chain wouldn't collapse tonight. It would start making mistakes tomorrow, and the mistakes would compound, and inside a week, the entire logistics architecture would be contradicting itself. Blade picked up the drive he'd dropped and carried it to the workstation. The screen was live, logged in a transport manifest open. He scanned it in under 10 seconds, the next 72-hour cycles routing the destination codes, the authorization signatures. Lane's name at the top of the clearance chain, the same single signature he had seen in the cross-reference data from the regulatory paperwork 3 nights ago. 1 floor below, something changed in the building's acoustic signature. The foot traffic rhythm had shifted, shorter intervals, more weight, the particular cadence of people moving with intent rather than routine. The soft alert had just become a hard one. Blade took the drive, killed the workstation's power at the hardware level, and was out of the archive room in 40 seconds flat. 2 floors down, Celine was already running. She had entered through the HVAC duct 6 minutes after Blade's 12-minute mark, not early, but not waiting for confirmation either. The cryo bay's patrol cycle had run exactly as she had described it to Blade: 22 minutes, 4 guards, 2 at the door, 2 walking. She had used the 4th minute of the cycle's walking phase to take the door guards out of the equation, 2 short surgical engagements. neither of them firing both of them on the floor before the walkers completed their circuit. The cryo bay was cold and blue and filled with the hum of sealed tanks running at operational temperature. 2 rows, 20 units per row. She moved along the left row, reading designation codes until she found it. Subject 0, Tank 14L status. Sealed biological integrity indicator showing green. Michael. She put her hand flat on the tank's exterior panel and felt the temperature differential through her palm alive, running intact. She found the emergency release handle on the side housing, identified the manual release sequence, and stopped. The alarm was sounding now, not the facility-wide klaxon, but the sector alert, a lower tone that pulsed at 2-second intervals. Somewhere above her, the response protocols were executing. Locked bulkheads, emergency lighting, transition asset protection priority, which meant Quint. She did not release the tank. Not yet. Not with the response already in motion and no exit window confirmed. If the tank came open now, Michael would need time she didn't have in this building. She memorized the release sequence, marked the tank position against the bay's exit geometry, and moved for the utility tube. She was 6 meters from it when the bay's secondary door opened. Quint was not running. He walked, which was worse, the measured pace of something that didn't need to hurry because it had already calculated the outcome. He was in partial shift, the musculature of his shoulders and arms, carrying proportions that civilian security clothing wasn't designed to accommodate. And he moved between the tank rows with the directional certainty of a system following a signal rather than searching. He was tracking Eve. Celine's hand went to the UV rounds in her left magazine. She had loaded the alternating configuration at the drainage easement silver on the right UV, on the left 2-weapon protocol that every death dealer learned before their 3rd decade. She brought the left weapon up and fired twice at the mass of Quint's upper chest. He stopped. The impacts had registered. She could see the tissue response. The flinch of a biology absorbing energy. It wasn't designed to absorb quickly. UV rounds didn't kill lichens, but they slowed the regeneration cascade that made super lichen physiology so resistant to conventional damage. And 2 seconds of slowed regen was 2 seconds of something closer to vulnerability. She crossed the 6 meters to the tube opening in one of those seconds and was inside by the end of the second. Above her, she heard the tube's lower entry panel take an impact that dented the steel inward by several inches. Then nothing. Quint didn't follow her into the tube. Too narrow for his current configuration, she had banked on that had measured the shaft's width against his shifted frame when she first identified it as an exit option, and the math had been correct by approximately 4 inches. She went up fast. Blade came out of the archive floor's east stairwell into a bulkhead-locked corridor and found 2 Antigen response personnel at the far end, both in tactical configuration, both turning toward him as the stairwell door opened. He crossed the distance between them and the time it took the nearer one to raise a weapon, put the first down with a strike to the larynx that would take him off the board for several minutes, and took the second's weapon hand at the wrist before the trigger was pulled. Controlled. No shots fired. He left them both breathing and went through the bulkhead's bypass release before the lockdown sequence could complete the seal. The route from the bulkhead to the storm drain entry ran through 2 more locked sectors. He bypassed the first with the facility's own emergency bypass code, the one that cycled to manual during power fluctuations, which Celine had mentioned and which Blade had noted as a systemic vulnerability the moment she said it. The second sector's lock had already been cycled open by someone moving ahead of him. He found Celine at the entry panel. Eve beside her, both of them inside the pipe manifold room's dead zone. Celine had a fresh cut along her left forearm that was already closing the region of a vampire's biology doing its work, without commentary. She looked at him, once confirmed he was intact, and looked away. Archive, Blade said. Cryo. She held up 2 fingers, the gesture of someone reporting rather than briefing. Tank 14, left row, sealed green status, Release sequence memorized. A pause. Quint is 2 floors below us. He'll be at ground level in 4 minutes. Blade moved to the opening. The charge activates in 90 seconds. Celine didn't ask what the charge was or what it would do. She put Eve through first, followed her, and Blade went last, pulling the panel closed behind him. They moved through the drain at a pace that was close to a run, the sound of their passage echoing off the curved concrete walls. At 30 meters, a low concussive thud reached them through the infrastructure. Not an explosion, nothing structural, just the sound of a server stack's power housing failing catastrophically and taking the adjacent unit with it in the surge. At 60 meters, they hit the exit grate, and Blade pushed it open, and they came out into the cold air of the river corridor. Behind them, through the concrete and steel and 50 meters of drainage infrastructure, Antigen's archive was dark. Its cold chain hub was shorted. Its regulatory paperwork trail was on 2 drives in Blade's coat, and its subject registry had a 2-inch hole where the primary drive housing used to be. The building was still standing. The machine's bloodstream had just been severed at 3 points simultaneously. Lane would know what had happened within the hour. He would begin damage control, activate redundancy protocols, call in whatever political cover he had left in the regulatory framework. And he would find that the redundancies were contradicting each other. The political cover required paperwork that no longer existed in any recoverable format, and the supply chain had begun making errors that no one at the buffer nodes could diagnose, because the hub that arbitrated between them was gone. He would figure it out eventually. Competent people usually did. But competent or not, Antigen couldn't keep running the same operation on a severed logistics spine. Something had to change. Consolidate, retrench, pull its assets to a defensible core. And a defensible core had an address. Blade looked at the drive in his hand, then pocketed it and walked north along the river corridor, Celine and Eve 2 steps behind him, the city dark and cold, and beginning very slowly to understand that something in it had started to die. The paperwork broke first. Carla Voss received a call at 4:17 in the morning from an Antigen compliance officer whose name she had never heard, asking her to recertify 6 transport authorizations that had already been filed and accepted. She asked why. The compliance officer said there had been a data integrity issue and certain records required re-entry. She said she would need to verify through her supervisor. The compliance officer said that wouldn't be possible at this hour. She said she would call back in the morning. The call ended. She didn't call back. She opened her email instead and found 6 unread messages from 3 different regulatory bodies, each one requesting clarification on antigen clearance documents that had been filed under her certification number documents she had no memory of approving. She spent 20 minutes cross-referencing. Then she called the Oversight Bureau's emergency line and started reading them the authorization codes. Blade had left her number in the regulatory system's flagging queue 2 hours ago, alongside a compressed file of the chain of custody records he had pulled from the archive. He didn't know her. He didn't need to. The system would do the rest. By 5 in the morning, 3 of Antigen's 7 active transport authorizations had been suspended pending investigation. The remaining 4 were still running, but they were running blind. The cold chain hub's failure had pushed every routing query to a backup server that hadn't been updated in 11 days, which meant the convoys were operating on a schedule that no longer reflected reality. 2 of them would arrive at buffer nodes that had already received that cycle's shipment. 1 would arrive at an address that had been vacated. Gregor's depot was the 4th. And Gregor, who was not a loyal man so much as a careful one, had been watching the regulatory news cycle since 3 in the morning, and had made a decision by 4:45 that involved emptying his walk-in unit, loading a personal vehicle, and taking a route that did not pass through any of the checkpoints he had previously used. Blade watched him leave from the roof of the tire recapping plant next door. He didn't stop Gregor. Gregor was a shipper. What mattered was What Gregor was no longer shipping, which was anything to anyone for Antigen. Another node gone dark, not by force. By the oldest mechanism in logistics, a man deciding the risk wasn't worth the fee. Blade descended from the roof and walked east toward the part of the city where the second problem was developing. The Coven had moved. Not against Antigen directly, that would have violated the terms Blade had set in the parking structure, and Iona had struck him as someone who understood that violating terms with a daywalker carried consequences she couldn't afford. But they had moved against something adjacent, a Lycan faction that had been using the confusion around Antigen's collapse to consolidate the one asset everyone in this war suddenly wanted more than anything else: Eve's location. The Lycans had pulled a signal heat signature, biological marker. Something Blade hadn't been able to fully triangulate, but which suggested they had tracking technology that predated the Purge and had been running quietly ever since. The Coven had picked up the same signal through their own network and had sent 4 people to get to Eve before the Lycans did. Neither group had found her yet. Both groups were moving through the warehouse district south of the river corridor, converging on a position that was approximately 6 blocks from where Celine had taken Eve after the drainage channel. Blade sent one text message to a number Celine had given him at the easement. 4 characters, 2 numbers, and a compass direction. He didn't wait for a response. Celine had already moved Eve twice since the river corridor. The first relocation was precautionary standard post-extraction protocol, put distance between the exit point and the safe position before stopping. The second was because she had picked up a tail, a single individual careful staying at the edge of her awareness rather than closing, which meant professional and patient rather than opportunistic. She had lost the tail in the second relocation, using a route that required knowing the building's internal layout and having a specific key, both of which she had acquired from a contact she didn't trust and therefore hadn't told Blade about. That was how it worked. Selective disclosure. She gave him what served both their objectives. She kept what served only hers. She was reading the text when it arrived. 2 numbers, 1 direction. She translated it against the neighborhood grid she had been building in her head since they left the Antigen perimeter, and understood immediately the convergence point, the timeline, and the direction she needed to move Eve to stay outside both approaching groups' vectors. She looked at Eve. "We're moving again." Eve didn't ask why. She stood up from the floor where she had been sitting with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door, and pulled the oversized jacket tighter, and waited. They went out, through the window. Blade reached the warehouse district at 5:40 and spent 8 minutes reading the 2 groups' movements before he did anything about them. The Lycan faction, 4 individuals, none of them in shift coordinated, but not trained at the level of military precision, was running a loose perimeter sweep that assumed their target was stationary. They were wrong. The Coven's 4-person team was more disciplined, running a grid search that would eventually turn up Celine's first relocation point. He didn't engage either group directly. What he did instead, he found the relay point the Lycans were using to coordinate their sweep. A modified cell repeater bolted to a fire escape 3 stories up and put a timed short-circuit device against its power housing. He found the vehicle the Coven team was using as a mobile base and flattened 2 tires with a kind of quiet implement that produced no sound and left no trace that wasn't explainable by road debris. He found the route the Lycan team's sweep would take in the next 12 minutes and placed himself at the one point where 3 alleys converged, so that when the sweep's northern arm came around the corner, they found him standing in the open in the light of a single sodium lamp, doing nothing in particular. They stopped. He looked at them for 3 seconds. They left the way they had come. Fast. That was the entire engagement. No shots, no blood, no chase. Just the specific geometry of what a daywalker standing still in your path communicated to people who understood what a daywalker was. Celine found Michael at 6:12, Not the tank, the man. He had come out on his own, which was either impossible or meant that the cryo system's backup power had done something unpredictable. When Antigen's primary grid took the hit from Blade's charge, the tank seal had released. Michael had walked out. He had made it approximately 4 blocks from the Antigen building before his body, which had spent 12 years at suspension temperature and was operating on stored biological energy that was not going to last much longer, had found a doorway and stopped. He was conscious. Barely. Celine was there, inside 90 seconds of receiving the location signal that Eve's hybrid biology had apparently been broadcasting without either of them realizing it, the same signal the lichens had been chasing, which had led not to Eve, but to the stronger biological resonance of Michael's hybrid physiology, coming online after 12 years of silence. She didn't say anything when she found him. She put one hand on the side of his face and confirmed that the eyes that opened were the right color, carrying the right recognition. Then she got him upright and moving, and did not slow down to feel any of it, because feeling it required stopping, and stopping was not an option. Eve appeared at her left shoulder 30 seconds later, having apparently tracked the same signal from 2 blocks away and made her own decisions about where she needed to be. Celine didn't question how. She just adjusted her grip on Michael's arm and kept walking. Blade was 3 blocks north when his phone showed a security camera feed he had been monitoring since midnight. The loading dock of Antigen's secondary administrative building, the one that housed Lane's operational center. The feed showed 2 SUVs being loaded with cases. Not cryo cases. Document cases, drive housings, the kind of portable archive you assembled when you were not planning to return. Lane was evacuating. Not fleeing, evacuating. There was a difference. Fleeing was reactive and disorganized. This was scheduled, timed, controlled, which meant Lane had anticipated the possibility of exactly this outcome and had prepared for it, which meant there was a third facility. Somewhere the subject registry backup lived, somewhere the research could be rebuilt, somewhere the operation could reconstitute itself, given enough time and enough distance. Blade looked at the feed for 4 seconds. The second SUV's rear plate was partially visible. He had the number. He had the direction it was heading. He had, from the chain of custody records, now sitting in a regulatory bureau's inbox, a list of 3 properties registered to Antigen subsidiary entities within a 50-mile radius. The machine wasn't screaming. It was packing its bags. He put the phone away and started moving. Lane had a head start of approximately 11 minutes. It was not enough. Lane had chosen a water treatment substation 3 miles east of the city center. A legitimate utility property registered to an Antigen subsidiary under a name that appeared nowhere in the chain of custody records Blade had fed to the Oversight Bureau. He had found it through the third property on the subsidiary list, cross-referenced against the plate number from the SUV feed confirmed by the cell tower ping that placed Lane's primary device at those coordinates 12 minutes before Blade arrived. The property had a fence and a guard post and a camera array and a second layer of fencing inside the first. Standard commercial security. Blade went through the gap between the second camera's sweep arc and the guard post's sightline in the time it took the guard to finish his perimeter check and return to his position. He had mapped the sweep timing in the first 90 seconds of observation. He was inside the inner fence in under 3 minutes. The substation's main structure was a 2-story concrete block with a transformer yard on the south side and a loading bay on the north. The bay doors were open. One of the 2 SUVs was still there, its rear cargo area empty. The other was gone. Inside the bay, a man in a technician's jacket was connecting a portable drive array to a laptop balanced on a shipping case, his back to the door, working with the focused efficiency of someone on a deadline he had set himself. Lane looked up when Blade's shadow crossed the threshold. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't shout. He looked at the doorway, then at Blade, and then he looked back at the laptop screen and hit a key sequence that Blade recognized as an overwrite command. Blade crossed the bay in 4 strides and took Lane's wrist before the sequence completed. He pulled the drive array free from the port with his other hand and stepped back. Lane stood still. He was smaller in person than the architecture of his operation had suggested, a lean man in his 50s. Dark hair going gray at the temples, the kind of face that had learned long ago to show only what it chose to show. He looked at the drive array in Blade's hand with the expression of someone recalibrating rather than panicking. "The override already started," Lane said. 11%. Blade glanced at the progress indicator on the laptop screen. "Not enough." Lane was quiet for a moment. Then, "You understand what you're stopping. I understand what you're building." "A solution." Lane's voice was even boardroom flat. "Silver immunity. UV tolerance. The conflict between our species ends when one side can no longer exploit the other's biology. That's what the research is for." "You were building weapons," Blade said, "and using people to do it. The subjects are subject numbers on a cold storage log." Blade set the drive array on the shipping case and looked at Lane steadily. "I've heard the pitch. It doesn't change the inventory." Lane held his gaze for 2 counts, then looked at the drive array. Whatever he saw in Blade's posture told him the calculation he was running wasn't going to land in his favor. He was right. He had built a system that required him to be the one person who knew where all the pieces were, and he had done it so well that when that person was removed from the equation, the system stopped being operable. That was the design flaw. That was the head. Blade put Lane on the floor with a strike that left him conscious, functional, and unable to operate a keyboard for the next several hours. Then he took the laptop, the drive array, the case it was sitting on, and the second drive housing that Lane had been moving to the other SUV when Blade arrived. He stacked them by the bay door, took the compact charge from his coat, and set it against the substation's primary server housing in the back room. 8 minutes. He walked out of the bay and did not look back at Lane, who was sitting against the wall, in a way that suggested he was already composing what he would tell the regulatory investigators. Who would arrive, Blade had sent the property address to 2 separate oversight inboxes before he came through the fence. Whatever Lane told them, he would be telling it without the paperwork, without the registry data, without the cold chain routing records, and without the research archive that had just been reduced to 11% of itself. The water treatment substation was not going to explode. The charge was sized to take out server infrastructure, not load-bearing concrete. The building would still be standing when the investigators arrived. Lane would still be inside it. Celine was 6 blocks west when the brief concussive sound reached her. Not an explosion, more like a transformer failure, the kind of industrial acoustic event that a city absorbed without registering as significant. She was moving Michael through a maintenance passage between 2 commercial buildings, his arm over her shoulder, his body working at approximately 40% of its normal output and improving slowly. Eve was ahead of them by 20 meters, navigating by some combination of instinct and memory that Celine had stopped trying to analyze. She had received nothing from Blade since the text in the warehouse district. She didn't expect to. The terms had been clear, separate vectors, separate closures. She heard the sound, marked its direction, and kept moving. At the end of the maintenance passage, a steel door opened onto a service road that ran parallel to the old rail spur. David was waiting at the door with a vehicle and the particular expression of someone who had driven through 3 checkpoints to get there and was not interested in discussing it. "You look terrible," he said to Michael. Michael looked at him. "You're shorter than I remember?" Celine put Michael in the back seat, let Eve take the other door, and stood outside the vehicle for a moment with her hand on the roof. The city was beginning to gray at the edges. Not dawn yet, but the hour before dawn. The sky running from black to a dark nautical blue that meant the dark would be over soon, whether the war was or not. She got in. Blade was at the river corridor's north end, at the base of the highway overpass, when the substation's server housing went. The sound was distant and clean. No secondary detonation, no structural failure, exactly what it was supposed to be. He stood in the shelter of the overpass support and turned the 2 drives in his hands. The Regulatory Bureau had the chain of custody records. The oversight inbox had the property address. The flagging queue had Carla Voss's certification audit. The cold chain hub was already making the buffer network contradict itself, and by the time anyone at Antigen subsidiary addresses tried to access the backup registry, they would find 11% of a corrupted overwrite and a federal investigation tag on the domain. Lane would spend the next several years explaining paperwork that no longer existed in any coherent form. Iona's coven had gotten 2 of their 6 specimens out in the confusion. Blade had seen the extraction team moving during the warehouse district operation and had noted it and said nothing, because 2 out of 6 was not the payoff Iona had negotiated, and it was not a violation of the terms he had set. It was a coven doing what covens did, taking what they could reach and calling it a win. He had cut the 3rd extraction when it tried to move through the same tunnel junction he had already closed. The team had withdrawn. He had let them go. That was how it worked. Not clean, just less dangerous than it had been 12 hours ago. He put the drives in his coat. Then he pulled out the small device he used for photographs and scrolled back through the images from the first night. The antigen label, the double helix, the name in clean sans serif type. He held the image for a count. Then he deleted it. He didn't need the record. He knew what he had found, and he knew what he had taken apart, and neither of those things required documentation. The documentation was for systems. He wasn't a system. He was the thing that came before systems existed and went to work when they failed. He walked out from under the overpass and north along the river road. The city pressing around him on all sides, the checkpoint generators beginning their morning wind-down helicopters, peeling off to their bases, the surveillance grid dimming as the Purge's overnight enforcement schedule cycled toward its daytime configuration. Antigen wouldn't reconstitute. Not this version with this infrastructure under this name. The logistics spine was broken. The research archive was mostly ash. The clearance paperwork was evidence, and the man who had held it all together was sitting in a concrete room waiting for people with badges to arrive. Some other version would try eventually. They always did. But that was another night's work. He didn't end the war. He made the machine unable to feed it. The city opened up ahead of him, gray and cold and unchanged on its surface. And Blade moved through it the way he always had, like something the dark had decided to keep.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notifications so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.